With this, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Hans Beck of Münster University, who will speak about Aesop's logoi, environmental setting, eco-critical approaches.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Andrea and Ruben, for the opportunity to be here today and talk to you in the room and talk to an online audience who is in one way or another with us here today. I would like to begin my conversations about a somewhat unexpected, in environmental terms, unexpected authority, Aesop, with a comment on and reference to Leslie Kirk's fantastic 2011 book, Aesopic Conversations, which offered a fantastic analysis of a subaltern voice from below, Aesop's voice from below, that engages in conversations about non-philosophical wisdom, quotidian ethics, and the pitfalls along the road to their realization. Tim Whitmarsh, in his review of Leslie's work from 2011, Tim Whitmarsh in his review said, I quote, this is, quote, a brilliant and original book which will transform the way we read early Greek literature, end quote. Now, if Tim Whitmarsh was ever mistaken, then it was this verdict of his. Not the first part, this is a brilliant book. But has it changed the way we read Greek literature? Probably not. The corpus of Aesop's logoi remains among the most understudied textual traditions from archaic Greece. That's just a given fact. Typically taken to metaphorize political constellations in the archaic period, to be more precise, in the late 7th and 6th century BCE, Aesop is one of those great fable tellers who has lots of things to offer, but who speaks in metaphors that are mostly appropriate to be told to children. Interestingly enough, we do know quite a bit about Aesop's life at this point, from the later 7th, his lifespan from the later 7th to the mid 6th century BCE, roughly speaking. We know about his life trajectory, as it were, probably born on Thrace, coming through the Aegean into central Greece, and then most likely dying in Delphi, spending his life as what sources call a slave, but we realize that there are many connotations of the word in Greek, so that's harder to pin down. In any case, he does offer, and he does lend a voice to subaltern views, to a different view of, say, the views raised in Tyrtaeus, in Homer, or in Hecataeus. Now here's one of those great examples, Logos number 195, that speaks to political metaphors, and this is how Aesop is typically read and interpreted and cited, and this is also how Leslie Kirk approaches him. A lion became king, wise and just, called for an assembly. There the hare said, how I have longed to see this day. The weak can take their place at the side of the strong without fear. Clear resonance of what Hesiod says about local basileis in Aspra and Thespiae, and marking this environment in one way or another. Now, mind you, I'm not going to show you any more comic book illustrations as the PowerPoint unfolds, simply because it is very obviously my intent to move Aesop out of the children's book section and out of the kids' room into the very center of our conversation here at this conference. Aesop describes animal and sometimes plant interactions before the backdrop of the natural environment. If the actual quarrels mimicked by him played out in the sociotope of the archaic Greek polis, his animal agents played tricks on one another in the physical world, fully exploiting the advantages nature bestows upon each species. The notion of environmental grounded agency places Aesop's tales right between Homer's early ethnography and Hecataios' cultural geography, which begins, Hecataios born in around 560 BC, which begins right at the end of Aesop's lifetime. So at the same time, Aesop's logoi raise key questions about how we approach ancient environments in textual traditions, how we retrieve landscapes, imagined or real, from the scripts of the past. So in total, how historical environmental studies may draw on authorial plots, textual written plots of nature in our sources. Christopher Schliephake has recently observed that the ecological turn, obviously in classical studies, is in full swing. This conference, this enterprise, CAES, is a vivid testimony to the process. And Christopher has identified for us the various branches of the field as it evolves. Ruben has alluded to some of these in his introduction also. With the new natural sciences and their methodology and their approaches, on the one hand, certainly one of the more and most impactful new approaches shines through. At the same time, more canonical and more traditional approaches in history and archaeology persist. And of course, there are multiple nuances betwixt and between these broad strands, textual approaches and modern scientific approaches, environmental, humanities, and technological approaches on the other. With these major avenues of exploration, the endeavor to look at ancient authors and look at authors like Aesop is actually a very timely endeavor. In Aesop's case, the problem is accentuated, our problem of reading texts and extrapolating environmental data from those texts. It is accentuated because of the text as such. What I'm using here today, and I'm wondering, you're wondering what's his Aesop? Who is his Aesop text? What I'm doing here, and this I believe is the common consensus, if there is ever such a thing, is I'm using the English penguin in these translations that you will see. I'm using the English penguins, which are based on a Greek text that was established in the 1920s in the Bude edition. There is no English-Greek edition. So I'm using the English translation from the French Bude Greek, and there is a 21 new German edition, a Tusculum edition, that has German and Greek text side by side, but this varies again from the penguin. So yes, we do realize that the textual composition is complicated, but this is what I'm doing. I'm looking at penguin translations, I'm looking at Greek texts from Bude, and I'm bringing them together wherever I can in the latest edition of the Tusculum text. My approach has been to survey the entire corpus, that's 358 logoi at this point in the penguin, and distill them, as it were, for this brief talk today. The immediate thing that surfaces from such a survey approach and from a structural approach to the data that is scattered and spread out across 358 logoi is the immense scientific precision, as it were, the scholarly interest in nature and the environment that Aesop puts on display and witnesses for us long before Aristotle and Theophrastus. So to the best of my knowledge, Aesop has never been approached through the lens of the environments that he actually describes and that he puts into his plot. For the sake of this presentation, I just narrow it down to 3 clusters to illustrate my case, and we'll see how that works for us in the end. On research precision and scholarly responsibility. In number 19, Aesop says that in the beginning there was only chaos and water, but Zeus wanting another element, and so on, talks about the beginnings and the rise of the world as we know it, the physical environment. And he talks about the separation of two domains, land and sea, and how these came about. Obviously, in a very impactful model, because Aristotle in the Meteorology later draws on this and discusses Aesop by name in this passage. This is what Aesop had already said about this, and he puts Aesop's perspective into a, well, at that point, rather advanced environmental discourse. So there is a serious agenda to this. There is curiosity in the scientific backdrop to the stories. This continues in these examples on the screen for you when Aesop talks about the creation of man. In this text, man alone remained naked, and then the text continues to speak about the various abilities of humans. Creating men and women alike, he moves on and talks about the creation and the beginnings of food productions from an academic point of view, not from a fables perspective, as it were. And there, in the next step, moving on, he talks about how man, how humankind became learned, absorbed certain qualities that allowed people to exploit the world, and as such work in correspondence with and make the most of their natural environment in order to sustain their communities. These aspects too find strong resonance in Aristotle later on. Aristotle looked at these texts from a very serious point of view and integrated them into his discussions, in this case here, parts of animals. Very briefly glancing at the terminology will tell anyone who knows the zoological and the botanological and the biological language here that Aesop offers and operates with a rather peculiar, specific, learned ancient Greek language set. So he just doesn't speak of birds or of any types of animals. He's very precise in his depictions. On many cases, on many instances, he would zoom in and explain the precise natures of an animal or of a plant. I just go through this in passing here. These ideas about precision translate into more general concerns with seasonality. The issue of seasonality is the idea of seasonality and what to make of this. Following up on Hesiod and his advice to the farmer about 150 years earlier, Aesop would draw on the same topic and stage many of his logoi, many of his stories in an environment and in a narrative plot that is geared toward and informed by the changes of the seasons. This one in 73 about the north wind and the sun having a contest of strength, which is funny in and of itself, and we don't have to go through the details of the story, but again, it's about the wind and the sun as expressions of the season, which is more played out in more detail in these examples when the summer is demarcated and accentuated as a period with its own qualities that brings life to communities, while the winter does the exact opposite. One day winter mocked spring and made fun of her. As soon as spring arrived, no one had any peace any longer. And then he would again chart those various activities and communal agencies as they evolve under different premises and in different setups in the summer and in the winter time. All this leads to something that I found the most striking aspect in Aesop's work, and that is what he calls the nature of locality. It comes in a rather simple story again, and it's the backdrop to another of the logoi, which concludes with a beetle saying, "Oh, don't blame me, it's simply the nature of locality." You know, and that's just the way it is. It's the physis to tabu that is critical to whatever human beings are doing. It's a highly localized environment and a highly localized setup that provides human, metaphorized, animal agency with a concrete local setting. Lions live in dens and donkeys in meadows, and the desert is a dead place, etc. That all shines throughout the logoi. But Aesop takes these observations and puts them in the context of a highly localized, rather concrete environment. Now, this is the problem, because with physis to tabu in mind, I'm wondering how specific Aesop actually is. For one, the logoi clearly offers stereotypical depictions of natural features. It's a river, a mountain, a tree. Clearly, these things are multi-adaptable to an ancient Greek environment. So these depictions evoke the idea of what I would call a meta-environment that is appreciative of the local quality of nature. It's appreciative of the local quality, the nature of locality on the one hand, but on the other, fully geared toward the universal communicability of the story as it shines through. Very rarely does Aesop actually mention specific places. Hardly ever does he mention a place by name. The Meander River is one rare exception, as is Cape Sunion and the Nile River. These are about the only three real places that shine through in 358 fables. So while modern research and what we're doing in more technically inspired and enabled and empowered approaches, while modern research traces microclimates, microenvironments, and ecological diversity, often local idiosyncrasy, as it were, while all of this has become an immensely powerful and immensely insightful field of study, Aesop fosters the idea of a coherent environment, of an environment that is shared by all, yet at the same time is subject to the nature of locality. Would be curious to know, and I'm very curious to hear your ideas about this, how representative this conception has been and is to archaic and classical Greek conversations about Hellas as an integrated natural world, as an integrated natural environment. I quote here in passing and throw out here in passing the idea that connected environments, that the Greeks viewed their world as something that is a connected environment, that this idea is very prominent otherwise, for instance, in traditions about rivers and wells that are connected underground and that just appear somewhere, they disappear somewhere else, and then they resurface again. And the idea from Homer to Pausanias is that it's the same underground river that these things are being allegedly connected, and everything is drawn into one coherent environment. Last idea for this talk, and this is when things are getting a little more, I'd say, daring. I wonder how far we can take this idea of specificity, and as a historian, as a cultural historian, and as a social historian who is interested in the natural environment as the backdrop to human agency, I'm tempted to ask if there is, I'm tempted to probe if there is a little more that we can squeeze from this textual tradition, or as Ruben had just beautifully put it as, if we can make lemonade from the lemons that seem to be these texts. This is the Aesopus River today in the background. Funny how Aesop in 70 and 213 describes as a metaphor certain qualities that are later on notoriously attributed to the Boeotians. That's in later times. Aristotle, who cites Aesop quite a bit, says that the Boeotians are like homocs, just like these are beaten down by knocking against each other. So are the Boeotians by the civil struggle. And in these fables, number 70 and 213, it's against oaks fighting against reeds and pomegranates fighting against apples. Interesting to note maybe, and although just a side note, that the pomegranate tree is very prominent in the Aesopus Valley in antiquity, and the Aesopus Valley is known for this. I owe this insight to my colleague Roy van Beck, and we talked about pomegranates a bit recently. It's funny how Boeotia, and famous for its pomegranates, was active as a colonizing entity in Thrace and on the west coast of the Black Sea. Attested cases are Astakos in circa 710 BCE, Byzantium 658 BCE, Chalcedon 684 BCE. Funny, in Chalcedon we actually find a tribe that's called the Aesopodores. Those were given by the Aesopus. The Aesopus? Aesopus? Aesopus is very close. In any case, the Aesop Romans, which is yet another text that starts in Plato's times, but is available to us only in a 4th century CE text. The Aesop Romans in chapter 6 says that Aesop actually received his poetic inspiration from Boeotian muses, to be precise, the Helicontian muses. The whole story in the Aesop Romans number 6, I invite you and encourage you to read, is a superb locus amoenus, which triggers again the question between highly idealized environments on the one hand and specificity on the other. In 110 appears a human. That's one of the 2 occasions in the entire set of logoi where a human by name appears. It's the seer Tiresias, who is famously associated with the spring that you see in the back here, the Tilphosa fountain in Boeotia, again. Very close to the Helicon, actually, on the northern slopes of the Helicon, and very close to the Aesopus Valley on the other side. And we realize that Tiresias' fate was intertwined with the natural environment around Tilphosa, that famous mountain, because he drank water from that fountain and he died because of environmental interactions. I leave us with that. In conclusion, Aesop's writing provided an exemplary case study for the ecocritical reading of an ancient text. Indeed, intriguing if scrutinized for environmental concepts and concerns, and the various ways the logoi treat the subject of nature. In doing so, we move the narratives of the logoi into the very arena of their stage play. We can see almost naturally an environmental discourse before us that is both a challenge and an inspiration to environmental history as the field unfolds. Clara Bozak-Schroeder has published a remarkable book in 2020. It's called Other Nature's Environmental Encounters with Ancient Greek Ethnography, in which she explores the cultural construction of nature in Greek tradition and the bearings this has on Greek processes of ordering the world, and how corresponding processes in the present actually have a similar implication. Aesop's logoi are destined to speak to this very topic because they place the issue of cultural construction of the environment in the very center of their narrative. Rich in specificity and nuance, universalizing in their script, and yet alert to the highly localized physics to talk to the nature of things, the comic logoi Aesop has many interesting faces, I believe, and the environment is certainly one of them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you, Hans, for this new reading